give a little bit of revision for this topic. So, I mean, yes, they can all swim. That's correct, but that's they're all marine animals, and that's fine too. But that's not really what I wanted to know. When we said what are they all got in common, and they all have eyes, yeah, sure, that's true as well. But that's not really what I was going for when I was trying to figure out what they all had in common. I mean, obviously, I still gave you the correct answer because, yeah, sure, those things are correct. They are. I wouldn't be too sure if I would say penguins are. Yeah, I wouldn't be too sure if I would say that if I'd say penguins are marine animals, but yeah. If you look at these three pictures really closely, there is something odd about them all. So firstly is going to be the thing that I believe was Brendan said was like they all have thin like they all have thin like structures on their arms. So they all have this sort of like paddle kind of attached to their arms. Now, of course, for the penguin, that's going to be a wing because it's, you know, but it still looks a little bit, and whereas for the fish, we call that a fin. But it's kind of interesting that they all have that same sort of structure. The other thing that I was really hoping that someone would get, but I think someone just said it in the comments. I'm not sure who that was in the comments in the chat. Yeah. Brendan Chang sort of said this. If you look at their bodies, all three of these have the same body shape. They're all quite long. And yeah, they kind of sort of focus down into a torpedo kind of shape. And that's going to be really good for when these things swim because there's going to be very, very little air, very little water resistance. And that's why they're in this shape. The last one that I'm going to draw attention to is sort of what Tina said, which is that all of these guys are pretty, you know, fat and got a lot of fat on them, and that's really good because they can use that to sort of survive in the cold climates. Now, the reason I wanted to really get your attention to this is that these three animals are even though they're actually relatively similar because they're all in that way. However, this on the far left is a bird. This in the middle is a mammal, and this on the right, the seal is a mammal, and the fish and the tuna fish is obviously a fish. These three things are from three different parts of the animal kingdom. They're three different phylums. These are very, very different. Okay, the mammal is probably the closest thing to us. This is closer to an eagle than it is to us, and this is obviously a fish. But even though these three animals are very different, they do still, even though these animals are very different, they still have the same features. And that's because of an idea, and I've already talked about this idea, but this is an idea called convergent evolution. The idea is, and the reason for convergent evolution is it's the best tool for the job. If you go around the world and you look at ancient tools, you will find a version of the hammer in every single society because ultimately the hammer is the best tool for banging stuff. You know, whether it's nails, rocks, you know, there will be a version of the hammer in every society. So it's the same thing here. All of these animals have evolved to have some form of fin because it makes paddling through the water so efficient. And although they've all evolved them independently, They haven't evolved them from a common ancestor. And we can tell that because they're completely different phylums. They still have all evolved to have that. They've also all evolved to have long bodies that are, allow them to swim through the water easily. And those long bodies that allow them to swim through the water easily is something that it's the best tool for the job. It's the best way for them to swim through the water really quickly. Obviously, they haven't learnt that from each other. And the last one is they haven't evolved it from a common ancestor. And the last one is, of course, the body fat. Of course, living in a cold climate, they've all had to build up body fat to deal with the cold. And they've all sort of adapted that. They've all sort of got that because of evolution, but they've got it because it's the best tool for the job, not because they've evolved from an ancestor. Now, if you look at something like I don't know, humans and apes, we've evolved from the same type, from the same ancestor. So it's a bit different when you look at us and you look at apes and you say, wow, look, we both have, we both can walk on our legs, we both have body hair all over our body. You can sort of say that and say, but that's not because it's the best tool for the job. That's because we've evolved over time to look like that. And that type of evolution is a bit different. That type of evolution is more like divergent evolution, which is where one species splits into two different species. And that's because over time they're forced into that. So let's talk about today's lesson. Let's talk about what we've done to get up to today's lesson. So let's actually go all the way back to the very, very start of this topic, just as a quick refresher. I thought this might be a good time to do a quick refresher before we start the new term, just to check to see if you guys have forgotten or remember anything, but it's a quick little, trip down memory lane. We started talking about evolution as being, and this is the main idea of evolution, the main is how heritable traits or behaviors within the population change over time, change over different generations. The idea is every generation is a little bit different from the previous generation, and that's because they all inherit something different. Evolution is change in a species over time, ultimately. We talked about some vocabulary, what was a population, what was a community, what was an ecosystem. Yep, this is last term's work. This is just a quick summary. We then talked about what we meant by ecosystem, and we talked about what we meant by organism, just in case, and I wanted to make sure, just in case you guys were confused about what we meant. Then we talked a bit about what is the difference between evolution and metamorphosis. Remember, evolution happens over generations, not over one animal's lifetime. So that's when we talk about evolution. Yeah, sure, an animal can change as it evolves, animal can change from a caterpillar to a butterfly, but that's not evolution, that's a metamorphosis. If after generation, the butterfly gets bigger wings or different color wings, that would be evolution. We talked about how a giraffe, obviously the giraffe adapts to the environment. If it wants to eat branches off trees that are really high, then obviously some animals are going to evolve to have that ability. And then what we did, we talked about, well, how does it do that? It does that using mutations. Every so often when you in a cell, when you make a copy of that cell, even when you make genetics, when you try when the sex cells come together, every so often they make a mistake. Some of those mistakes are mutations. Some of those mutations, here's a mistake here that didn't copy correctly, but you end up with two different types of DNA. That's a mutation. There is always a chance you get a mutation. The chance is low, but there is still always a chance that you get a random mutation. Mutations can be bad, or mutations can be good. Mutations might help you adapt to your environment better. So, and sometimes mutations can be bad. They might just mean that you can't, like, you're allergic to everything and then you just die really young. That's, sometimes mutations are bad. And we talked briefly about modification. We said these different animals have evolved differently. And we talked briefly about LUCA, which is the fact that evolution predicts that we came from one common ancestor. Is the chance of getting someone says, is the chance of getting a bad mutation higher than a good mutation? Yes, it is. It is far more likely that if you have a mutation, it's far more likely that you will get a mutation that doesn't help you than a mutation that does. It's far more likely that you may just grow an extra finger coming out of your hand. And it's like, well, that doesn't help you at all. It's like, it gets in the way. It's far more likely that you will grow. It's far more likely that you might, have all your hair on your body be white or something like that. Mutations are more likely going to be bad for you. Some mutations may not get in your way very much, like they may not make much of a difference in your life. You may have an issue where your toenails, break off faster than normal. It's like, well, that's not really a big deal. But yeah, some mutations can be really bad, pretty much, and then turn it and make it very difficult for you to live. Now, because LUCA is this understanding that we all came from one old ancestor. If we've all evolved, and we've all evolved to be slightly different, then it makes sense that back in the day, we were all the same animal, or the same organism. So that's what we call LUCA. It's like the idea of the very first forms of life. And then basically theories of evolution. Who came up with it? Charles Darwin. And he essentially came up with this idea of descent with modification. Your children will be slightly different than you. We moved into talking about biodiversity. He said biodiversity is really important because if one of these species gets sick, then not everyone in that species will get sick, of course. And that's because we need to have variation. We talked about variation is really important. It's caused by mutations. It's also caused by sexual reproduction, so different genes mixing with each other. We said that sometimes a variation which leads to a survival advantage is called an adaptation. I love this picture. This is probably my favorite picture that I found over here because it just so clearly does the job. It's like, look at that white rabbit blending into the white snow, whereas the brown rabbit is pretty obvious in the background. It's a really good picture. And that white rabbit is, the fur being white is actually an advantage. And it's a good mutation in this case. And of course, we talked briefly about this idea of a gene pool. And gene pool refers to different types of alleles getting passed on. If you look at this white fur, if that rabbit survives and is able to have, rabbit babies, then it can add that white-haired gene to the gene pool, and so other rabbits can have white-haired genes. It is possible, though, if some horrific accident happens, if the brown rabbit, like let's say the brown rabbit gets eaten by a fox, then it's not going to be able to add its brown-haired genes to the gene pool. So the gene pool will change, and that's the gene pool meaning that no other animals will have that same sort of thing. So that can cause a variation in the population. It can cause the population to start to have more and more white hair. Another way that you can get a change in a gene pool is also emigration. It's like if an animal leaves an environment, goes to a new environment, it's going to take its genes with it. So if a bird flies to a different location and then starts to have children with other birds, then it's going to take new genes and spread them around the world. Yeah, we talked about artificial selection, which is like the opposite of biodiversity. It's where you replicate an organism to all be the same. We can actually artificially select different things by only planting one type of plant. And I showed you an example of how you could get to orange carrots by over time slowly doing evolution. We've been doing this idea of selective breeding for a very long time. That's how we have so many of the vegetables we have today. And then we talked a bit about like, well, what can we do with artificial, what can we do with now to do selection now that we're, you know, masters of science. It's like, well, we've got artificial insemination, which is where you take if you find one organism is really good at its job, maybe it's a plant, maybe it's a specific horse, maybe it's a specific dog, you can then take that semen from that and make so many babies, more babies than that particular racehorse or cow or dog could ever have, and then you've got so many copies of these good genes. In vitro fertilization, that's IVF. That's actually doing adding the sperm to the egg outside of the body, which is really good because it means you can choose which of a particular genes you like before you put that egg into the mother. And cloning, we do this all the time with even with stuff like plants. But there's a problem with the gene pool. It's the same problem. If you do all these things and you limit to only a certain type of gene, what you end up with is a population that is exactly the same. And that can be bad because if that particular specialized genes, if there's a problem with it, like for example, someone gets sick, everyone gets sick. We talked about natural selection, which is the opposite of artificial selection. Natural selection is when nature, like birds flying in and eating animals, does the job of choosing who will survive. And we said, well, because nature has to fight to survive, it becomes this idea of survival of the fittest. The animals that fit in the best, for example, the orange lizards that fit in with the environment the best, are going to be the ones that survive and get to pass on their genes to make more orange lizards. And that's what natural selection is. But natural selection is based off variation, selection, and competition. We talked very briefly about those, and this is what the questions are going to be about. Variation meaning that you have different types of animals. Some of those animals have genes that will give them an advantage. Some of them will have genes that won't give them an advantage. If you have genes that give you an advantage, you probably have more kids. If you don't, then you probably get eaten. So that's why variation is important. Selection is also what is doing the choosing. That might be the fact that it's very cold, and so therefore you have to evolve to deal with the cold. You may be because your environment is very white, so you have to deal with the white. Your prey might be moved very quickly, so you need to deal with that in some way. And if you can't deal with that, if you have a mutation doesn't let you deal with that, if your variation doesn't let you keep up with your prey, you're going to starve and die. And hopefully those in your species that can keep up with prey will pass on their genes and so on. So that's selection. And then the last one we talked about was competition. Ultimately, you've got to compete for food, for mates, for everything, to not become prey. So the best people are competing. The best animals that are getting food, the best animals that are not getting eaten, they're going to be the ones that at the end of the day pass on their genes. And that's how natural selection works. I love this example. If you look at all these cars on the right, variation is the fact there are so many different cars. Selection is the type of racetrack. So maybe it's a very, long racetrack. So therefore only big cars can win. And the other one is competition. Obviously all these cars are competing to be the first to the bottom of the racetrack. So, and the one that is at the bottom of the racetrack, well, in nature, what would happen is that you would then take that winning car and you would make copies of that winning car because it's so good at what it does. And that's sort of how natural selection all works. Talked about how beating natural selection, bacteria can be quite nasty. Bacteria can sometimes, it can also have mutations, but if you wipe out a bacteria using antibodies, what can sometimes happen is that if you don't wipe out all of the bacteria, some of it is resistant. That resistant bacteria can make new copies that are also resistant because, it's natural selection, but it's kind of our fault. Same with animals that sexually reproduce. You kill a bunch of animals with some kind of spray. That animal then has children of its own. Its children are also going to be resistant to the spray. So again, this is another form of being resistant, another form of animals beating natural selection. We talked a bit about the history of evolution. I'm not going to deal too much in this sort of stuff. We talked about how we figured out that it was a long time, that the Earth has been around for a while. We all came from a common ancestor. We discussed, we're going to talk about this today actually, if we get time. And then we talked about how originally they thought the reason that evolution occurs is because it makes sense that if you are always stretching your neck, then you get a longer neck. If you're always digging in the ground, then you'll gain longer fingernails. If you're always climbing trees, then maybe you'll get a longer tail. But obviously, that was proven wrong by when August Weismann started to cut tails off mice and noticed that, they didn't pass on that cut tail gene onto their children. And then we talked a bit about making new species. New species is made when we have two different animals that are so different from each other that they can no longer breed with each other. That's pretty much how you can tell that you've got a new species. Phyletic evolution is evolution that happens over time, but divergent evolution is when two populations are separated in some way, and so they evolve different traits to deal with their environment, and so on and so forth. We talked about how that works. So that adaptive radiation is like divergent evolution, but it's on steroids. You have a lot of different animals that are very, very different. And then we talked about convergent evolution, which we talked about today. Coevolution, where two organisms evolve at the same time. So as the bee evolves, the flower changes, and as the flower changes, the bee has to evolve. And then we talked briefly about extinction and how if you can't adapt to changing your environment, you're doomed to die. And that was it. That was what we've talked about so far. So that brings us to today's lesson, which I know that I've already spoken to for 45 minutes, but there aren't too many slides for today. And if I don't get through all of them, I don't really care. It's not for me, it's the big deal. It's just I wanted to make a start on something new. Before I do that, are there any questions on what I've covered so far? Anything from the previous couple of weeks that that you guys were like, oh, I forgot about what that was, or anything that you guys want me to go back over because you still don't understand it, or If not, I'm going to move on. Okay. So, lesson 55. We will be able to explain how fossils are formed and dated. So, fossils are really important when it comes to evolution. And I'm pretty much going to say this in the next slide, but I'm going to tell you guys now anyway. Fossils are really important because it gives us an idea of what animals and organisms used to look like back a long time ago. So we can see how those animals may have evolved over time by looking at what those animals or plants or organisms look like now. You can also sometimes get an idea of like, okay, like how those animals behaved, how they walked as well, by looking at other fossil clues, which gives us even more information. It's not always the easiest thing to do, but fossils are a great way, and essentially it was one of the ways that helped us, as I said in the past, prove that evolution happened, because you could look at different animals change over time, and also gave us this idea of extinction, that animals died out a long time ago. So therefore, if animals died out a long time ago, then we can go, okay, well, why did they die out? Did they evolve into something new? So first we're going to start off with what are fossils? Okay, and this is some new content here. So I would like you to write this down if it's okay. New content. This is something I want you to write down. Fossils are part of an organism such as feathers or teeth, bones, or leaves. Or they can be evidence that life existed, like burrows or footprints. Both of those, there are other examples as well. Maybe broken eggshells are another example of life once existed. But yeah, these are both two examples of, two examples of fossils. The study of fossils is called paleontology, and fossils give us an insight into the past, into past forms of life, and hence helps us explore evolution. So yeah, if you look at the skeletons of ancient sharks, and you look at their teeth, or you look at their size, you might be like, okay, well, look at this. They've only got one row of teeth, but as they've evolved the second row of teeth or something like that. Or maybe you can look at their teeth and you can go, how sharp were their teeth back, 100 million years ago? Or how does that compare to how sharp their teeth is now? Stuff like that. Fossils are really useful for that. Yeah, feathers, teeth, bones, leaves, branches. You can have fossilized pieces of wood. As I've tried to do consistently, I don't want you guys to think of, oh, fossils are just bones. Like, yeah, well, no, bones are really great, but other things can be fossilized too. Footprints and burrows are interesting. I mean, obviously, if you see a hole dug in the ground, but I'm not sure how you would find a fossil of a burrow, but yeah. I'll give you guys another maybe minute, 30 seconds to copy this down. Then I'm going to change the slide. If you weren't aware that you had to copy this down, guess what? You have to copy this down. They're also rare, but they're not super rare. It is likely that you may find a fossil on a rock of a leaf or something. It's not actually the most rare thing in the world. So next thing about fossils, we're going to change the slide now unless someone says please don't. Okay, how are fossils formed? I like you copy this down too. Now this is the same sort of pictures that I actually drew a while ago, but it's just a quick refresher if you want to do. Usually when an organism dies, other organisms break it down until there is nothing left. It's called decomposition. Okay, it's we know this. It's why food rots. It's why if you it's when food rots, that's what it's called. It's when an animal dies. You know that eventually other animals will eat the meat and flesh, and then maybe the bones will get broken up and crushed over time. Or it'll just rot because fungi and other microorganisms will eat it. Yeah, thanks. I was trying to do my pencil joke here. It's a fossil anyway. But there is, of course, a way we know already from when you guys deal with food in the fridge, there is a way to stop something breaking down if you cover it really quickly. If you put Glad wrap over it, or if you put it in a Tupperware container, you can stop that organisms getting to it and breaking it down. And the same thing occurs in, that's what I should have done. The same thing occurs in the environment. If that organism gets covered up soon after death by mud, lava, silt, tar, you know what I should have written down here? Snow. Snow is another one. Then the organism can't be decomposed. So, for example, whoa. So if you cover it up really quickly, then those organisms, or whether they be other animals coming to eat the flesh of that animal, or whether it be microorganisms like bacteria trying to get in to break it down, they might not be able to get to that skeleton to break it down, or get to these flesh to break it down. So what can happen is that because it gets covered up by one of these lava, mud, or silt, or whatever, then what will happen is that will turn into stone or rock. And then eventually that rock might get exposed back to the surface, because maybe humans are digging foundations for a new, I don't know, say building, and then they uncover them. Maybe it's because the ground shifts in an earthquake and they uncover them. But there are multiple ways. Maybe someone just trips over them while they're walking around. There are multiple ways that a fossil can be exposed. But that's how they get formed. You need to make sure that that organisms get covered up very, very quickly. And as I said, yeah, snow and ice is another way. That's why they've found mammoths encased in ice. And yeah, because they are, not only because they're encased, they don't get broken down. Because they're in ice, it means the bacteria acts a lot slower to break it down. So they've actually found like mammoths that they can actually get like skin. They can actually look at the skin and the fur of a mammoth. They found human bodies that have been from millions upon millions of years ago in ice. And they've actually, one of the parts that I found the most amazing is they actually were able to look at that body from millions of years ago and look at the contents of that person's stomach to see what cavemen used to eat, or what this caveman used to eat, and stuff like that. It wasn't really a caveman, but still. And I was like, whoa, that's next level stuff. And it was, yeah. And I feel a philosophical question for you. When does digging up a body turn from creepy and grave robbing into archaeology and paleontology? Think about it. Or don't. Anyway, so I'm going to move on now. On the picture on the right is actually a picture of a dinosaur, and one. And number two, the dinosaur gets covered up by rocks and silt, and then it gets flattened and squashed by layers of rock being put on top of it. And then eventually, of course, it gets pushed to the surface by what looks like some kind of earthquake or movement. Before I actually move on, I actually wanted to do this slide here. I don't actually have to talk about this slide. There's no pencil here, there's no copying this down. I just wanted to throw this up. Fossilization can be weird. And this is a personal fact that I learned myself a while ago. sometimes water gets into a fossil. So if you notice down this picture in the bottom right, you might have a fossilized tooth. But then water gets into that fossilized tooth and it breaks it down. And in number 3, we can see that that tooth is now broken down and it's gone. And that, because that tooth is gone, it's going to leave a hole. Now you might be like, okay. And you can actually look at these holes and use that as evidence of a fossil. What can sometimes happen, which is cool, is that minerals can get into that hole and make mineral versions of that. Above here, what you've got is something called, it's called opalization. And it's when opal gets into a fossil. So this is an opal snail, and this is obviously some kind of tooth here, and it's been fossilized, encased in stone. Water's got in and dissolved this, but then eventually that water's got enough opal minerals in it to make an opal in the shape of this tooth or in the shape of this snail shell. So you might look at that and you might be like, oh, obviously that was made by a jeweler or something, you know, some kind of arts person. Like, no, that was made by nature. I'm like, that's pretty cool. But yeah, so, and it's kind of, it's called, this idea is called replacement. And it's where, and it doesn't have to be opal, it can be other minerals as well. But it's when one mineral can get into a hole and replace what was there. So it can mean that maybe you have a skeleton that's not made out of bones anymore. Maybe it's a skeleton that's made out of, you know, quartz or something, because it just replaced it. Also, by the way, I'm not sure if you've watched Jurassic Park, and I don't need to talk about this, but if you haven't, sometimes animals can get stuck in amber, and then when that amber crystallizes, it turns into a solid, and then that solid can get buried, and millions of years later, they can find fossilized versions of animals. What's cool about amber, yeah, it is from straight from Jurassic Park. What's cool about amber is that, and the fossilization of it, is that the animal is completely intact. Like, there is no, like, the flesh doesn't dissolve, the wing, you would not normally be able to see the wings of an insect in a fossil, probably not normally, so that everything is intact. So we can actually get a fair bit of information about this animal just from this picture, just from like these things. And of course, yeah, and this happens, yeah, so as long as it gets encased in enough amber, then yeah, you can see it. It's kind of cool. I kind of, yeah, it's an interesting sort of way to look at it. Okay, dating fossils. So this is the next idea. But yeah, that was just two random things about fossilization that I thought. There are many ways that they can get to. There are many different ways to get fossils can be created. It doesn't just have to be encased in rock, but of course that's the most obvious way. When you look at dating fossils, there are two ways that we can date a fossil. We can date fossils using comparing one fossil to another and looking which one is older, which one is younger. But it doesn't really give you much information. And then you've got absolute dating. Absolute dating is finding exactly the age of something, finding exactly how old something is. Yeah, I'm glad someone appreciated my cheap, lazy, dorky Photoshop. Yeah. So yeah, so we're going to talk about both of these ways that fossils can be dated, and how you can look at a fossil and go, well, this is how old it is relative to everything else, or this is how old it is exactly. I'm going to avoid going into super high amounts of detail, because obviously you guys don't need super high amounts of detail, you just need to know the basics. So the basics start off with relative dating. So relative dating, and by the way, this is dating things compared to one another. Relative dating is like saying, I'm older than my brother. That's not really useful. It just tells you, okay, you know, if you had like a list of things, you knew which one was older. Whereas absolute dating is like saying, I'm 31 years old. So yeah, let's go have a look at relative dating. Now, relative dating can be done, is usually done with sedimentary rocks. Now, again, one of the things that I hate about school is that we don't necessarily always teach you guys. You want to go back for a second? Sorry, I'll go back for a quick second. I'm just going to go back for a fraction of a second longer. If you don't know, by the way, ladies and gents, the image on the right is taken from Tinder, and I'll leave it to you guys. I'm obviously not on Tinder. I just stole this off the internet. Oh yeah, dating advice. I'll leave it up to you guys to figure out why it's called. Why I used the picture of Tinder on here. Oh, like what we learned in chemical reactions. What do you mean? So Lena just said, like what we learned in chemical reactions. Oh no, not that kind. No, I now know what you're talking about. Let's just no. Yeah. Also, when we talk about relative dating, we're not talking about dating your relatives. That is not right. Even if they're stepsisters or brothers or whatever. Okay, now relative dating is when you dating advice for dinosaurs. Relative dating is how you can date something. Now, it annoys me that we don't really teach much about sedimentary rocks when it comes in high school, because like we're supposed to, we actually are supposed to give you guys a topic on geology every couple of years, but they never do it. They only, because geology is just not cool enough. They always just skip it instead to do biology and chemistry and physics. So yeah, but it's, I have to talk a little bit about it now, but yeah. So sedimentary rock is rocks that are formed in layers. The reason that the rocks are formed in layers is because one layer gets put down by a stream or a river, and then another layer of rock gets put on top of that, another layer of rock gets put on top of that, and over time you end up with rocks that look like this, that have, you can actually clearly see each layer and how different it is. And sometimes you can look at layers of rock and you can be like, this layer is darker than this layer is lighter than this layer, and that might be because, oh, well, this layer is darker because the river got really big, so a lot more larger rocks moved in. You can actually see, I learned this from university, you can actually see in a lot of rocks, if you look at a certain point, you'll see this big, large black line. And that big, large black line is when there was a lot of volcanic eruptions, and so therefore there's a lot of ash in the atmosphere, and so it actually forms in most sedimentary rocks a little black line you can actually see. But that's not the point of today's lesson. We're not talking about sedimentary rocks as much as I would love to teach you guys about. I would love to teach you guys about geology. We're talking about fossils. Now, you can compare fossils in different layers. If a fossil shows up at the bottom, like in some layer at the bottom, that fossil is going to be older than a fossil that shows up near the top. Because that layer was put down first, whereas this layer was put down a lot later. So therefore you can use that to say which one is older and by how much. And that can be used to compare different fossils. This is originally how we would have compared fossils at the start. Is they would have said, well, this was formed in this layer, it was this deep, so therefore it's probably this old, it's older than this fossil. And you can also tell is that this fossil will evolve into this fossil over time. Well, not fossil. The organism that made that fossil will evolve into the organism that made the other fossil over time. You do have to be careful about plate tectonics and the movement of the ground. So you can see here, for example, this large crack that's happened in the rock. That large crack may move part of this structure upwards and part of the structure downwards. So you're going to be careful when you compare the layers and you take that into account, but most people can figure that out. It's like, oh, okay, maybe this layer here and this layer here are the same. So I've got to be careful when I compare the two of them. But yeah, like this is that's what relative dating is. Any questions, queries? I'm going to leave this up for another 30 seconds and then I'm going to move on to the next topic. All right, so next up, absolute dating. Now, absolute dating, it can be done, and this is a large sort of slide, so you can take notes on this if you want to try and, if you can summarize this, then yeah, I'd strongly suggest you give it a summary. But yeah, let's talk about it. Okay, so absolute dating can be done using radiometric dating or looking at the isotopes in a particular fossil. An example of this is usually carbon. So when you eat some food or whatever, when you breathe in, when you get carbon dioxide into your body, whenever you whenever carbon is in your body, it's in a mixture. There is a mixture of carbon-12 and carbon-14. Now, most of it's carbon-12, but some of it is carbon-14. Obviously, a very, 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 very small amount of it is carbon-14. I think it's about like 0.3%, but I'm not too sure exactly how much it is. But let's just say that if it's 0.3%, let's just say that there is like, I don't know, 30 grams of carbon-14 in all of the carbon in your body, okay? Now, the trick is when you die, you're not going to get new carbon into your body. So that's it. It locks at that amount. It locks in 30 grams. You're not going to get more carbon-14 because you're not going to eat anything after you die. When you die, you don't breathe anymore. So you can't really exchange carbon dioxide. So if you die and you've got 30, can you get in a coffin that is airtight? You could get in a coffin that's airtight, but it doesn't really matter because even if the coffin isn't airtight, you can't breathe because it's like you're dead. So here's the trick though. We've talked about this. Did we talk about this? Did I teach you? Yes, I did teach you about half-lives. Was it this class? No, that was year 9. I'm getting my year 9. Sorry, that was last year. Getting my year 9s. Hopefully from last year you guys learned about half-lives. The idea is that carbon-14 is going to turn into carbon-12 over a long, long time. After one half-life, that 30 grams is going to turn into 15 grams. After another half-life, you're going to have 7.5 grams. After another half-life again, you're going to have 3.75 grams, and so on and so forth. Carbon-14 and carbon-12 are quickly, just because someone was asking, carbon-14 and carbon-12 are isotopes. They're both still carbon, but carbon-12 has 6 neutrons, whereas carbon-14 has 8 neutrons. And so, yeah, over time, the carbon-14 will turn back into carbon-12. It will lose its extra. It will lose its extra neutrons. It'll just fly away and decay. And the time it takes for 30 grams to turn into 15 grams, for half of it is called a half-life. It's called a half-life because we say that's how long it takes. Now, the half-life for carbon is 5,730 years. So if you looked at a piece of carbon, let's just say you looked at a human body, that was really, really old, and you found that there's only 3.75 grams of carbon 14. They wouldn't actually do that. They'd actually look at the concentration of carbon 14. But let's pretend that for simplicity's sake, let's just say that. What you would do is you'd say, well, that means if there's only 3.75 grams, then that means there has been there has been 1, 2, 3 half-lives. That body has been around 3 half-lives since it died. And so you would say, well, if 1 half-life is 5,730 years, 3 times 5,730 years means that this body is going to be 3 times 5,730. That means this body is about 117,000 years old. And so you can get a rough idea about, or you can get a more accurate idea as how old something is if you just look at it. If you go and you find out that it's been 10 half-lives, then you know that it's about 57,000 years old. If there's been like 100 half-lives, then you know that you're looking at something that's closer to 5 million years old. No. If there's been 100 half-lives, that's 500,000 years old or so. So it gives you an idea of getting exactly how you can do it, and that's what radiocarbon dating is. Of course, some fossils don't have carbon in it, so you can, like, if you think about, a footprint, that's not going to have carbon in it because it's not an actual organism. But you can still do similar radiometric dating on using other things like using potassium or other atomic decay. So potassium decays in a similar way to carbon. You could also look at uranium or lead. That decays in a similar way to carbon. So it's just, there are other ways to get it dating. And this is called absolute dating because it finds out when I say exactly, I don't want you to think that I can be like, oh, looking at this carbon dating, I can tell that this T-Rex died 30 million years ago on October 6th, and it happened to be a Thursday. It's not that exact. It can be like, oh, it died around about like 17 million years, 170 million years ago, but approximately, and you might be off by a couple of million years. But so it's absolute dating in that it gives you a more exact answer, but even then it's not exact. Right, I'm going to keep this slide up for another 30 seconds more. If you guys need more time, though, please let me know. But otherwise, I'm going to change the slide. Got one more slide to talk about today, and then we're going to wrap it up there. You may not have actually studied this last yeah, when you looked at atomic theory and stuff like that, and alpha and beta nuclear decay, because sometimes teachers skip over the carbon dating thing because it's not as useful or applicable. I always try to teach it just really quickly, but you just should hope. I would have hoped you would have remembered half-lives, but if you don't remember what a half-life is, now you know. Now, obviously, the whole point of this is not necessarily, you don't necessarily need to know what a half-life is. You don't need to know how to do these calculations, by the way. I was just sort of showing you that as a bit of an interest. But yeah, you do have the important thing you need to understand about absolute dating is that it uses atomic radiation to predict almost exactly how old something is. Now, let's talk about the very last slide here. We've got two extra slides, and this is a good slide to end on, I think, because it sort of finishes up and it sort of talks about why are fossils so important. And fossils are so important because they can tell a story. And this fossil here is actually a relatively new discovery when it comes to paleontology. This is a fossil called the oh man, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this, but I'm going to try. The Archaeopteryx. That's what I'm going to try and say. I'm going to have to look this up. The Archaeopteryx. And what they discovered about this fossil is that it can be super useful for understanding evolution. Now, I'm looking at this fossil, and I have to admit, I can't really understand it very well, but that's why there are paleontologists that do. What they discovered about this fossil is that it had sharp teeth, claws on its wings, and it also had a long tail, just like a dinosaur. But, and this is the kicker here, there was evidence of wings or feathers on its wings, like a bird. Now, this is a first. They'd never really been able to find evidence of feathers on any of the other dinosaurs in the past. And so scientists and paleontologists have started to predict that although a lot of the dinosaurs and the large dinosaurs probably died out, it's possible that some of them actually evolved into modern birds, the birds that we see today. And that's, if you're not sure if you remember, about a couple of years ago, there was this big thing, they were like, Jurassic Park is wrong, all dinosaurs had feathers. It's like, well, that's probably not completely correct, but it's probably not incomplete. It's probably not also not completely false. There were probably a lot of the flying, probably a lot more of the flying dinosaurs had feathers. They would have been scary, but yeah, sure. But yeah, this is sort of where I can see where there might be feathers. And so yeah, we can get this interesting idea of how you get an interesting idea on how a particular organism can evolve over time. Okay, I'm going to leave this up for another 30 seconds from now. But yeah, it's not, this isn't necessarily, this slide here is, I guess, trying to summarize everything we talked about fossils in one slide. Because it sort of tries to say, this is why they're so important. It gives us a way to look at how different organisms can evolve. They can go, well, this is an example of an evolutionary step between dinosaurs and birds. And so you can go from here, you can be like, I can find similar birds, or I could find similar dinosaurs. And you can be like, well, I can understand how this has evolved. All right. So summing up what we've been doing this lesson we've looked at fossils. We looked at fossils, essentially evidence of life, either actual parts of a living thing, like a feather, a tooth, a skull, a bone, or evidence that it existed, like a burrow or footprint. We said that the way they got formed is when an organism gets covered, or like a footprint gets covered by mud or lava or snow or silt or tar really quickly after it dies. And then that locks it up into stone. And eventually that stone can appear on the surface. We can date fossils by looking at relative age or absolute dating. Relative age is when they show up in different layers of sedimentary rocks. Obviously, the deeper the rock is, or the deeper the fossil is in the sedimentary rock, the older it is, and that's how we can date things relative to one another. Or we can get a bit more scientific and do absolute dating, and that's done by looking at the concentration of isotopes, the amount of isotopes in a particular fossil, and you can use that to go, well, given that there's not as much carbon-14, or given that there isn't as very much given there isn't as much potassium-35 or whatever it is for potassium, you can say therefore it's probably this old. And then we finished up by talking about the Archaeopteryx, which is an example of how a fossil can change our understanding of evolution of a particular species. I do want to quickly point out one of the interesting things about carbon dating is that, and absolute dating, because of the nuclear weapons used in World War II, and testing and stuff, has actually thrown off a lot of our data when it comes to examining the past, because now there's so much extra isotopes floating around in the atmosphere. Makes it pretty hard. Now, ladies and gents, there's about 15 minutes left in the class, and I'm going to actually give you guys pretty much all of Friday's lesson to work on these. But what I would like you to work on is 3.5, questions 1, 4, 6, 8, and 13, and 3.6, question 2, 4, 11, 12, 13. So that's 5 questions from 3.5 and 5 questions from 3.6.